and thank you all for coming back for our third and final session of the day. This final session is on listening and responding through respecting community voices. And with that as the content, we think it's fantastic that Britt is able to be the moderator for this. Britt Lake, she's the CEO of Feedback Labs, passionate about bottom-up development that empowers communities to play a role in their own futures and effective at building and leading professional teams to achieve that goal. She was a founding board member of Feedback Labs, and prior to that was the chief program officer at Global Giving. She has an MPA from Princeton, and as her work shows, she's a true believer in the need to listen and effectively respond to community feedback. So thank you for moderating, and we look forward to the discussion.
We are all excited to be here. I'm really excited to be part of this panel and to be moderating this session. We have an amazing group of panelists. And when I say that, I mean not just the three brilliant women here, but really everyone in this room. We want to make this an interactive session, so looking forward to hear what you all think, listening to your voices as well as ours about some of the issues and the challenges that we're talking about. But first, just to introduce the three panelists here, I'll start at the end. Dana Brown, she's been working in international development and humanitarian assistance for more than 25 years and currently advises donors and aid agencies on supporting locally led development efforts. Many of you in the room probably know her from her work with the Listening Project, where she directed and co-authored Time to Listen, Hearing from People on the Receiving End of International Aid, as well as other publications. A lot of you have probably read that. She's worked in Kenya, Tanzania, Kosovo, and Indonesia, and worked with international and local organizations in a bunch of other countries. Glad that Dana's here. Moving on, we also have Angela, which a lot of us have heard some brilliant comments already from today. She's currently the Associate Director for Advocacy at the Global Health Advocacy Incubator, which provides strategic support to local advocates in low and middle income countries to enact and implement laws that promote public health and safeguard from injuries. And previously, she was the Senior Policy Advisor for the Humanitarian Response in Haiti at Oxfam in the aftermath of the earthquake from 2010 to 2013. So excited to hear more from her. And then finally, we have Susan Wong from the World Bank's Global Lead, who's the World Bank's Global Lead for Community-Driven Development. She's led and worked on some of the largest CDD and local government programs in the world, including in Indonesia, the Philippines, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, India, Afghanistan, and Morocco. She's published on topics related to monitoring and evaluation, political economy, and community-driven development, and led one of the largest randomized impact evaluations in the world from 2007 to 2010 in Indonesia. But for most people in the room, you probably know her from being a friend of the Movement for Community-Led Development since its inception. So we're really excited, again, to have these three women on the panel, as well as all of you here. I'm going to start just with a softball question, and I'll go down the line here, and then we can open it up to the audience. But I think we're all in this room because we believe that every person should have a say in the decisions that affect their lives. That's why we're here. That's why we're doing the work that we do. So I'd love to hear from each of you if you could speak to why you believe this feedback is important to prioritize, and what are some of the critical challenges you have faced in listening and responding to feedback from communities. We can maybe start here with Susan.
First of all, thank you very much. I'm glad to see everybody here. I rushed over from the other side of town to catch all of you. I always look forward to when John invites me here. Wherever John goes, I follow. So thank you very much for inviting me. I know I'm probably a little different than other people that are joining and stuff, but I just wanted to have the opportunity to explain what we do at the World Bank and with governments and people around the world. I always look forward to. So just to, maybe some of you aren't that familiar with what the World Bank does in terms of this area. We basically have a very large community-driven development program. Works in about 18 countries around the world, about $22 billion. It's usually about 10% of the bank lending globally. So it's a fairly large and significant portion of the World Bank lending, and we usually do that to governments. There's some grants to NGOs and civil society groups, but generally it's directly to governments. So just to get to the point of why we think this is important, basically, if you don't have voice of citizens in development, you have bad development. Okay, that's basically what we've seen through the years. I have monitoring evaluation experience. I can tell you all kinds of ways, macroeconomists get it wrong, or, other people, policymakers get it wrong from capital. And the thing that I've learned is that micro really actually does affect the macro. Okay, and I've learned this over and over again from different countries, that what they saw at the macro level was actually not relevant at the micro level. Okay, so unless we have that feedback to citizens, meaningful feedback, not just consultations, not just reaching out and taking minutes of meetings, good development doesn't happen. Transformational development doesn't happen. And I think that's pretty much why we want to influence not just this part of the portfolio, but actually every single World Bank operation actually has a required, mandated right now, citizen engagement indicator. Okay, so across the portfolio, about $70 billion of lending per year, every project has to have some kind of citizen feedback mechanism. Okay, that's advanced over the last 5 years or so. So we started, a little bit behind, I think early on, and I think slowly the World Bank is slowly coming toward understanding how important citizens' voices, marginalized groups' voices are, women's voices are to the whole development process.
Great, thank you. Angela?
So as well, I wanted to say thank you, John, for asking me to come. I didn't know anything about this meeting today, so I'm happy to meet all of you. I just would want to answer that by just sharing a little story. When I was on my way to Haiti after the earthquake in 2010, the plane was half full of non-Haitian people. And, most of them had on brightly colored t-shirts, and it said mission, or church of this or church of that. And not to minimize that, but to say that I wondered when I was on the way to Haiti, how did these people decide that they were going to go to Haiti? An earthquake happened, and you just fall out of bed in Nebraska on a Sunday morning and say, hey, I'm going to Haiti to do work. How do you know what people in Haiti think about anything? Have you heard any of their voices? And that struck me as a very bizarre situation. And when I got off the plane, they were all talking about, we're going to go to this little town and that little town, and we're going to build a little thing, and we're going to build a little. And I thought, have you met any Haitian people who specifically asked you, can you come here and build this thing right here? And that made me realize that we were having two separate conversations about what people wanted versus what we wanted to give them. And it was crystal clear at that moment that we were going to enter into a situation where we were not going to be successful in Haiti. And I realized that before the earthquake, Haiti had a lot of problems. I'm not minimizing that. But the gentleman, the guy who was here just now? Greg. He said something very interesting to me, and then I asked him about it. He said, sometimes we're not going to succeed. And sometimes these countries are, the difficulties are so enormous that we may not succeed. And I wanted to say to him, I did not, because he's going back to work, and I wanted to say, that's because you all don't listen. Mm-hmm. You all have no clue what Haitian people want. Mm-hmm. You don't ask them. You pretend to ask them. You say things like, we had a consultation. Mm-hmm. But nobody knows what happens with the information from that consultation. How does it go up the chain? What happens to it? It gets written down in a nice little report, we send it off, and nobody talks about it anymore. And so when he said that, I wanted to say, man, let me take you out for a drink, and let me break it down to you. Here's how all the things that you could do. And the first thing you need to do is get into these communities in all over the country with various needs and hear what people are telling you, because they tell you what they need. They tell you how to solve it. They just don't have the necessary, some resources, some in terms of capacity, but Haitian people are not beggars. They know what they want. And it was the one thing about working in that country that made me realize that we were talking about them in a development sense in the wrong way. So that was my takeaway. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've covered it. Thanks also to John for inviting me. I just want to say ditto to what both of you have said. And I think, the people that we're talking about that are in the communities that live with the problems and are the ones that are going to come up with the solutions. I mean, they face this every day. They understand the issues far, far greater than any of us coming from the outside. And that's not just us, foreigners. It can also be people coming from the capital. And there's this assumption when we talk about local that we just assume that as long as you have a foreign national, that they're going to get it. And sometimes I've actually seen that, in some of the work I've done when I've worked with international NGOs and working with our staff or even with our partners, that sometimes there's the ability to listen, and the willingness is even greater sometimes from our national counterparts. And so I think that we have to be really cognizant of some of the biases and some of the challenges that we all face in listening. We all want to come and help, but that stopping to sort of say, okay, what is really the situation here, and trying to understand it from the perspective of the people who are experiencing it, and then getting to their stories and what are the things that they've already tried that haven't worked, so we don't come in and repeat the same mistakes, and working with them to find the solutions that are, we need to be playing more of a sort of a catalytic role, and that's a very different role than I think, many of us have been trained to and have done as development, workers and humanitarian workers. And I think it's really critical that you see this as part of your relationship and partnership building. And I think we've gotten the business of aid has gotten so big, and as we talked about in our book, so proceduralized that we've even proceduralized the way we listen.
That's a good
you
point.
were about that. But seriously, we have to, I think, is it Jane who said in the last panel, it starts with us, and how do we walk into a situation, think about how we're being perceived sometimes, and whether we're coming with, with a sense of humility and curiosity, whether we're there to really listen and learn and to see what is a role, is there a role, what role can I play? What role can we, as this organization or this donor, do? But we too often are coming in, like you said, people getting on the plane, I'm going to go and do this because that's what I know how to do. It's like we look for the nail, for the hammer that we have, and instead of sort of saying, can I add, I think someone in the last panel also talked about adding value, what value can I be adding? And sometimes that may be not getting involved in playing that role that you also talked about in terms of advocacy and educating people, and so I think it's a really, I don't see how you can do good development work, I agree, without listening. And somehow we've accepted that. Like there's a no penalty, unfortunately, in this business for not listening, except for continued failed projects and not very sustainable outcomes in a lot of cases.
Great, thank you all. And as I said, there's lots of great experience in this room. We heard a lot already from the three panelists here about the lack of trust, proceduralization of listening, not including voice sort of in the initial planning stages, a lack of humility and true curiosity in listening. But I'd love to hear from some of you in the room, what are some of those critical challenges you have faced or you've seen your organization face in listening and responding to feedback from communities?
I just have a question, actually. Nesvin, where did you go? There he is. At the end of the last panel, it reminded me of something that I think we all need to watch out for, and I'm just curious what the panel thinks about this, and that is consultation fatigue. And when people go into communities and talk to the same people over and over again, and how do you, and sort of concurrent with that is how do you choose who you speak with, who speaks for the community?
You've anticipated one of my future questions. My work here is done.
Well, I think Craig is gone, USAID, but World Bank.
Uh-oh.
Hello? Oh, okay. Ms. Wong, World Bank. My question is, what do larger donor organizations, or even, sorry, USAID is not here, but if folks have ideas, what do you do dealing with ethnocentric governments in certain parts of the world? For example, especially in post-conflict zones, where there's been decades of tension, for example, between two communities. One community is in power. They have these decades-old tensions between one another. One community is in power. So if all the aid goes through that one particular channel, controlled by one particular, for example, say, ethno-sectarian group, all the aid is channeled to the areas by that particular group. Examples could be in Africa, could be in Central Asia. What is a recourse? Is there a recourse option when it comes to analyzing the situations? Like, all right, in the past 18 years it hasn't worked. Let's reboot, let's reanalyze. Sorry, I'm all over, but that's the gist of it.
So there is going to be time for questions in this session. If we want to stick to answering the question now that we're asking for, we'll give you a chance to answer. But if there are any specific responses to the question that we're talking about around critical challenges, let's get those now. All right, great, thanks. And then we'll give Susan a chance to answer.
So Horta from World Vision. I worked as a community development facilitator in my own country. I was 22, passionate, and went into this village where, and I recall the name, Bishan, which actually means beast. They essentially devoured me at the community meeting. I was a girl. The critical challenge was that I was a national. That was not the issue. I was not from the area. I was young. I was female. And I went, regardless with how much passion I went in a meeting, and it didn't matter that it was to build a school that everyone wanted. No one was willing to give a bucket of water unless they were paid, because I represented an NGO. So some of the critical challenges back then was that who I represented as an organization, as well as who I represented as an individual. And the only way to overcome that, I went out, cried, and then I said, okay, I can be defeated, or I can make a comeback. And then the comeback was like, well, how do people in this village make the decision? I had already pinpointed 3 people that were vocal. I'm like, okay, I'm going to take them out for coffee. We went for coffee. That's how you do business back home. And I was the young person, and there were 3 older gentlemen. They ordered raki, which is our moonshine, local moonshine. And I said, well, I better order moonshine too, because we have to be equal on the table. And that was one of the things that I didn't have to report back to the office. But, but that was when I think of critical challenges back home. It wasn't necessarily about the motivation or the incentive. It was who I was representing, and also organizationally and as an individual, and also the ability, like those 3 gentlemen had to come halfway to meet me for coffee, regardless of the invitation that I made.
Great, thank you. So my takeaway is that if we want to get true feedback, we need to drink moonshine.
Okay, yes, I work for World Vision.
Maybe one more, if there's one other person, I think over here.
If there's somebody, somebody else wants. Just really quickly. I think a challenge for me, and probably for a lot of people, is getting away from the idea that going in with a sort of limited listening exercise and responding is community-led development. I don't think it is, and I think that, and I'm not saying anybody's implying that here, but I think that we are very often feel a lot more comfortable doing a survey or going and doing focus groups, and then coming away and saying, well, this is what we heard, and so now we're going to shape a program to go in and offer. And so listening needs to be part of, I mean, the challenge is how do we really accompany without taking charge of the process? How do we listen and be part of it without still leading? And that's really hard for us to do, I think.
Yeah,
for a lot of us.
That's a great point, and I think it brings into issues of power and adaptation and being able to be flexible with funding. So there's a lot of good issues there. Going back to the panel, maybe.
Can I just add what Ian said? I think that it's true, and as an anthropologist, I think ethnography is great because you do spend a lot of time, but I think that's a critical challenge because it really takes time to embed yourself and listen and become part of the community.
Great. And I think I'll come over to Dana maybe to start and maybe to address the initial question that came up. When we talk about feedback and responding, it's important to talk about how people in communities are responding to each other. And when we say community voices, who really are we talking about? Why is it important to pay attention to who is listening and being listened to in terms of how feedback is being received and used?
Yeah, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and sort of I've had ingrained in my head is sort of the first, our duty is to do no harm. And it is incredibly important that in order to not do harm and to not reinforce existing divisions and biases and systems of privilege and power, we have to really know the local context, and you have to understand the dynamics, you have to understand the relations, you have to understand who are the power holders, who are the power brokers, who are the quiet but influential people. And it's really hard to do that when you're parachuting, flying in. It's even worse in humanitarian programming, but it happens all the time in development programming too, because there's often the design period is a very short period of time. If you're not, even when you're already embedded and you've been working in a place, that doesn't mean that you're actually having the conversations about sort of bigger issues. A lot of the time the listening is very limited to sort of the thing you're trying to work on, the project you're working on. And so it's really important and really critical, I think, to look at, how local governments, how local organizations, businesses, leaders, how do they listen to their constituents, and how do they define who their constituents are? And sometimes a role that can be played is asking those questions and sort of nudging and supporting and making sure that analysis is being done, because the tendency, it's natural, right? We go to our networks, we go to the people we know, we go to the sphere of influence we may have. It's kind of scary sometimes to go outside your comfort zone. And in some places with conflict, it can be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. And so it's really important to be looking at it sort of from an M&E perspective, tracking, like, who are we actually listening to? Let's check, have we been reinforcing some of these systems of inequality and privilege that exist? And how do we make sure that those that are marginalized, those that are vulnerable, those that typically don't have a seat at the table, the youth and sometimes in some places women and others, how do we, in a contextually and culturally appropriate way, ensure that their voices get heard in the processes that not just we are undertaking, but that we are sometimes going through. In a lot of cases there are multiple layers and sort of partnerships, and there's only so much control that you may have, because a lot of work is often done by those at that point of the community. And how do we make sure that those that are leading things at the community level are really ensuring that everyone is included? And this is where sometimes there is a need for even within a lot of countries we're talking about, language is a huge barrier. Mm-hmm. And there are dialects, there are languages, multiple languages in many countries, and one of the things that was written in a number of places when we did listening exercises, we would have triple translation sometimes happening from the person who spoke the local dialect to the national to an international, and each layer you're losing a lot. And we have to remember that we can, but it is critical to listen with our eyes as well as our ears, and there's a lot that can be picked up, and I think it's just really important you can pick up on a lot of those cues sometimes through body language. And we don't talk about this, but I think that there has not been enough attention paid in development to sort of implicit bias training, and in communications, and how do we understand, all of us come in, it's natural, I mean, it's not a bad thing, but we just need to, how do we unearth and talk about the biases that we have, and that's going to be from your whole team, and in an office, or that may be with partnerships, and how have we made sure that we're hearing from a really diverse range of perspectives, because that does take time, and it takes time to do the analysis. It also takes time to get it right, and unfortunately, a lot of the programming, is very depending on, and I know sometimes it does come back to funding, and the proposal timelines and so on don't particularly make it easy to do the kind of deep listening and spending time in communities to really understand those dynamics. And it gets talked a lot about in, those of us that have worked in the conflict field, but somehow that doesn't always, it has not gotten as instilled, I think, especially in the humanitarian field, but even in a lot of development work, we talk about power, but we don't, it's done almost as a study, and often by an outsider. It's not always done by the people who are actually living and working there. And so again, who's doing the listening, who's doing the analysis, and who's then doing the planning and the designing should really be the local people. Like our role needs to be facilitating that process and not leading it, or too often being a consultant or outside firm brought in to do it for an organization. Because that learning doesn't stay in the organization or in the community group if they don't do it themselves.
Great. Thank you. You bring up some really important points, and I loved what you said about, loved the way you phrased it, not love that it exists, but we go to the people that we know. And I think that when we look at feedback and listening, we do find that feedback can make social service delivery more equitable, but only if done well. And those aren't anecdotal, there are studies that show this is the case. And if you listen to only those who are already being listened to or already sort of having their voices heard, what you do is simply entrench the existing systems. And so my next question is for Angela, and I'd love to hear a little bit from you about what are the challenges you've seen in feedback collection and use, and what efforts can organizations or individuals put in place to ensure that the feedback they're getting is truly inclusive.
So, language, as you said. In Haiti after the earthquake, many people in the world were under this misguided and quite false belief that Haiti is a French-speaking country. It's not. Haiti speaks Creole, 100% of the population, and about 15% of the population speaks French. Of that 50% of the population that speaks French, you're talking about more educated people. So you already within the community, you have the educated community, those who may have been educated in France or in the US. And then you have the other part of the community, which is the balance of the population, who may not have been educated in France, or maybe not even educated at all. So when we go to have these meetings in these communities, you're going to get the people who can speak French, with the UN person who can speak French, and they're just parlez-vous all the way down. And then you see people sitting at the back, and they're not saying anything. You're wondering, okay. So I picked up a little bit of Creole, and I would go and talk to people, and they had such a different perspective about the conversation that was going on at the other side of the room. Sometimes we would have meetings in Haiti in English, especially UN compound. At the UN the people coming from the UN compound, the meeting would all be in English, and the Haitian people, again, not present. Where you conduct meetings changes the dynamic of who attends. There were meetings we would have it in Port-au-Prince, in Pétionville, the cool part of town, right? The part of town where the president lives. Again, who attends those meetings is connected to who speaks 15% of the language, the French, who's connected to the educated people. Who's not in Pétionville? Average Haitian people. So even when we would want to organize our interventions and our conversations, we're telling people from rural parts of the community to come to Pétionville to talk to us, to take 4 different methods of transportation to get to us. 3 hours later than Like we tell them the meeting starts at 8 o'clock in the morning, they have to leave their home at 4 o'clock in the morning to get to us, especially after the earthquake. Because of the fact that the roads were so destroyed that you couldn't just get around town. So it was all these barriers to hearing some of the problems. And so when Greg, I think it was, when he said, maybe we won't be able to be successful, I thought to myself, oh man, I wish I could tell you. There's so much you can do. But we don't think on this way. We come in with this, we're going to have this meeting, it's going to be here, people are going to come, and we're going to sit in this nice air-conditioned room. Let me tell you, you're not talking to any of the people who will be impacted, who need what we're talking about. Those are not the people we're talking to. So we end up with a sort of analysis that that informs our program design that does not meet the need. And then we say, why did we fail? And the answer is we fail because we have those people in that room are not people that need what you're talking about. So that's been my experience.
Thanks. And Susan, I want to give you a chance to answer the question that was asked previously, and I think to take it up another level, the bank works with countries, so you're not directly on the ground talking with people as you're deciding your funding. So how do you promote feedback in your partnerships with governments and high-level government officials and encourage them to listen to citizens, especially if they are maybe not representing all of the voices that we just heard are important to listen to?
Thank you. So I think this is a tricky situation. I have to say, working with governments is a whole different ballgame. And you deal with a lot of issues that way. When I was thinking on the way over here, on my Uber on the way over here, I was listing down all the challenges, and I think I went 3 pages before I got to government even, right? So it's not easy, and I certainly know that from dealing with governments. But I want to say I actually have hope. I've been with the World Bank now 18 years. I used to be with NGOs, Oxfam, then UN, and now with the World Bank. I feel that there's ability to deal with, and I've dealt with some very difficult governments who come from decades of authoritarian rule, totalitarian rule, even that, where you see changes happening. Because there is a democratic kind of, in a lot of these places, there's kind of momentum happening, where people want more. The Arab Spring, for example, in different countries around the world. And I think that the World Bank feels, as a custodian of these public funds, some obligation that these funds are used to help poor people, for poverty reduction. It's not for the rich commercial farmers. It's not for the elite business people. It's actually really supposed to have poor people. Okay, and that's one of the problems, right? I mean, that a lot of the things are not sifting down to people who actually really need it. So, which is why I'm attracted on the community-driven development. It's really about having governments give funds directly to people, okay, in communities. They decide what they want to do with it, okay? And the bank actually has an ability to negotiate this with the government in terms of, okay, open meetings instead of closed meetings. Okay, women should have quotas for those meetings. Okay, all the things you see in America. I mean, I go to my DC council for people, right? If you don't have, a certain number of people in those meetings, you don't have the meeting. Right, so why don't we, so there's a lot of these kind of little things that we can do, I think, to help this. In a lot of the countries we deal with also, governments, their comparative advantage is not community facilitation. Let's be serious. It's pretty appalling. So in a lot of these countries, we actually outsource to civil society groups, just like in the US, you have a lot of services being provided by foundations and NGOs and so forth. The same thing in these countries. So in a lot of these countries, funds go to the Ministry of Finance or the different governments or Department of Rural Development, but then they contract out the community facilitation, the PRA, the organizing and so forth to civil society groups. Okay, so I think a lot of that actually can happen. I mean, it's certainly a challenge, and I've seen a lot of bad World Bank projects. I've seen a lot of very good ones, but it really requires a lot of attention to detail on what we're willing to accept. When we fund projects, and I think we feel an obligation that our funds are being used well, and that they do care. People do care about the voices that come up, because who knows better about injustice and inequality than the people who face it every day.
Thanks. And so that we can learn from you all, I'd love to hear if there are things that you have seen work in your experiences in the field or in your offices, in being more being able to be more inclusive in this listening and feedback collection and use. Oh, so many good examples. Can't wait to hear them.
Actually, I have a very cool question. I know this is a very important topic.
Right in the middle.
Yeah. I know communication is a very important tool, but sometimes people may tend to tell you what you want to listen. You want to hear from them. How do you validate that what they are telling you is actually what they meant?
Yeah, we'll take a few and then.
Okay. So Anne from Relief International. So first of all, want to echo or compliment you on the points about where you have listening is extremely important and the languages. But I think also the way you do it, meaning so many times we're under the gun to get an assessment done, a report. We know we're going to have to write it in English, French, but not a local language. We're going to have to make it sound pretty and academic and reference. I have rarely found that is what, at the community level, the way that they learn or can convey. So from the start, the way we're listening, we have our end product of a fancy report that is not going to be in a format that usually has little or no benefit to the local community. I know techniques we've used, and we get criticized because then we don't have a nice fancy report, but a simple thing of a brown piece of paper, and they're drawing, and you may be listening to how they're solving an issue, things, very interesting outputs. They get them implemented. If we get funding, those successes really get, I think, the credit they deserve because there isn't a fancy report that all of us at some college level. So just to think about what we have to deliver in our field and how that is counter to the responding side, even if we go out and do the proper listening.
We'll take two more over here.
One of the really, let's see, we stand under this and the speakers aren't listening to the mic. One of the things that we found was surprisingly effective is having communities listen to each other and do South-South cooperation in this field, because one of the things that we have that we may not take responsibility for is that we've seen a lot of different things. Stuff that inspires us, stuff that bums us out. And while it's true that the people in a situation of injustice know that injustice best, if they've had a chance to meet with their peers in other communities and seen other solutions, it sparks so much creativity and insight that none of us would ever have. So there's something about having the listeners be the peer-to-peer community. We had a bunch of local leaders from Bangladesh where local governance really wasn't working. Visit Kerala, where local governance really was working, and both women and men, and it was totally eye-opening. And we heard totally different things from the Bangladeshis after they had, been to Paris, basically.
We have one more over here.
So I think the listening piece, as I think Angela you mentioned, and Dana as well, that we've got consultations and we've got different tools for listening. But the responding, I think, has quite a bit of catch up to do. And so to John's point, I agree, it's important who does the listening. And we have, in my role as CEO of Humanitas, when we've done these types of community-based programs, always identifying who's best equipped to listen, that has credibility, that has the trust of a community. But then who is responding, what entity is responding also matters. And I'd like to make one very quick illustration. So there's this program in Guatemala, and we didn't have anything to do with this, but what had already been implemented were these cook stoves. And we went in with various UN partners, to be unnamed, but they're the ones who were, showing us some of the key things that we had to take into account. And this woman, and actually several women in this one village, were cooking over firewood instead of the cook stoves that had just been, I guess, installed 6 months ago, 7 months ago. And so one of the UN people said, well, why aren't you using that? You know, you should be using that. They didn't say anything. And so I later, I didn't speak Quiche, this was in Guatemala, so Spanish was the next best thing, and I asked separately, I'm like, so why don't you use those? And she said, well, we told them that we didn't like the way our food tasted. Like, our beans taste better when we cook them over fire, right? And so that may not have mattered to the donor and those who implemented it because they were thinking about the other functional environmental benefits of a cook stove, but a simple thing of a marginalized poor community, the taste of their food matters. So I go back to who is also responding to what they hear. Where if someone from the community would have said, this really matters, this is more important than whatever functional attributes your cook stove has, they care how their food tastes. And that, when we talk about dignity, those are the kinds of things that stick.
Yeah, thank you so much for that illustration. I'm sure we could spend the rest of this time thinking of similar illustrations about, you know, times when listening hasn't truly happened. And I'd love to give each of you a chance to speak to some of the questions or the comments that came up. Just as a reminder, we had a question about what do you do when people tell you what they think you want to hear. We had the comment about reports and end products. We had John's comment about communities listening to each other and tools for listening, but what is the work we're doing to respond? So I don't know who, I'll let you guys choose who wants to go first.
I think that the gentleman you asked about what they want to hear, what people saying what you want to hear, that happens all the time. Mm-hmm. Because I think that there's at some level, people are, in some of these countries, they just see when we come in, we are coming in as, you know, money bags. Mm-hmm. And they already know that we have no clue. They know. They can see you coming a mile away. And they know you're coming with some idiot project is what they're thinking. Way before you open your mouth. And then you tell them your project and they're like, yeah, sure. Sounds great, let's do it. Right? They will do that. So that is a real fact. But I think connected to what John says, one of the ways that we have tried that those intercommunal, where different communities from the same, you know, region or area are talking to each other, and that has been a sounding board for us. Because sometimes you get, when you talk to one group and then you go over here, well, does that mean what I think it means? You find out that it really doesn't. And that helped us a lot in Haiti, especially in some of the rural parts of the country. So that was one of the ways that we combated it. I also think that it's human nature, right? Because the way we come in this grand way, you know, we arrive, we got these big titles, and you got USAID behind your name, or Oxfam, people are like, oh yeah, this is going to be great, right? I mean, I've been in those conversations, so I think we have to really consider, you touched on it, this way of approaching this work with a more humble approach to it. I think when humble, more humility and more inclusivity in terms of talking about bias, because that's one of the things that we kind of always skirt around that conversation. So just a quick thing, when I got to Haiti in 2010, one of the things that struck me as really odd was that Oxfam International's office was almost all white. Mm. And I bring that up only to say that you walk in the office and the inner circle of the decision makers are all white Americans and Europeans. And the people who are doing are Haitian people. And those two conversations, those two people never were like connected because it was already perceived that the people who had the power were white, right? Let's face it. And I think that issue of this kind of bias where people on one side already perceive that they have no power, that's a done deal. They know they have no power. So their conversations are conversations that demonstrate that they have no power. And then the people who have the power, their conversations are also demonstrative of the fact that they have the power. So it was a weird feeling for me going into a country like Haiti where there's a Haitian population in the United States of educated diasporan people who were not leading us when we went to Haiti. But we were being led by a 30-year-old British woman who's never lived in a house that did not have indoor facilities. So I wondered to myself when I got there, that 30-year-old woman is going to tell these Haitian people how's that going to work? So I think that some of these conversations are higher level than just listening, but I think that the way we structure our interventions, all these parts need to be taken into consideration when we get down to who's going to get listened to, where they're going to be listened to, what language are they going to be listened to, because we don't even have good inclusive people even leading that conversation, right? That was my experience.
Or Susan?
So I think, sorry. On that, I agree, and I think that part of trying to avoid hearing what people think you want to hear is it's not just one conversation. This comes back to being there. Presence really matters, and or finding a way. If you're not going to be able to, you've got to build that trust and make sure that there's people that have the relationships that are actually able to have the conversations with people, with a broad range of people, where people can be free and will speak their minds. And there's also, and that's an issue. That's also not. We just assume, we're here, we want to listen, and we're going to put everyone in a circle, and we're going to show that we're really open and we want to listen, and people will speak freely. It doesn't even happen that way here, and so I think we have to be really honest about the limits of, and so I think one of the biggest challenges, which I didn't talk about, is that, most of our organizations don't have the systems in place to be capturing those little bits of feedback and input that you get by, talking to someone in the coffee shop, of, just the random conversations, and being really intentional about talking to people outside of these very formal meetings. Most of the time, you're not going to hear the things that you need to hear in any kind of formal meeting. Like Greg talked about the dog and pony shows. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's right. So you've got to find the unstructured time, Yeah. I started off as a Peace Corps volunteer. I'm sure many people did. And I worked with women's groups, and I just sat around the fire with women for hours, learned the language, and got to understand their lives and what was possible with them. And we can't all always do that. I can't go back and do that necessarily now, but finding a way that you can tap into that, really understanding what is happening beyond the confines of sort of your project and what you're trying to do is really important. And I think that you need to be asking that question about what you're hearing. Is this, really thinking, because often we're excited because people validate what we think they're validating what we want to hear, and we're like, yay! And then, you might want to step back and go, oh, well, maybe I should check that out with some other, get some other perspectives. Yeah. And you said, like, maybe having somebody else go in and asking the same questions that is local staff or local partners. But I think one of the biggest challenges is that most organizations don't have the systems in place, and they don't necessarily have the training. And I think one of the biggest issues is whether our organizational cultures are ones that are really open to listening. One of the things that struck me when we were doing the listening project, and we worked with a lot of international and local NGOs, was that some of the staff were worried about sharing some of the criticisms that we were hearing, because they were worried they would lose their jobs. Mm-hmm. They were concerned that these critiques from communities would somehow reflect badly on them. And that signaled to me that they weren't in an organization that was very open to hearing honest feedback. And so if the systems and the culture aren't there, it's very hard, even if you do fantastic listening, to get those views to be heard. And you could actually do more damage, I think, in some ways, if you spend a lot of time gathering feedback and then people don't see anything change. If they don't, this is why there's that consultation fatigue. People feel like they've been consulted many times, and then they don't see anything come out of it that reflects what they talked about. And so, in a lot of places, people get really discouraged. And I think that what's challenging, I'd love to hear too how the bank deals with that, because in many places, there's been years of this same approach taken, and now by the government doing it at a local level, or having trying to do that? Are they mimicking some of these same somewhat failed processes? And how do we get, ensure that people are really, I worry that people don't engage because the way that we have often engaged them has left a lot to be desired. And so then when we say, okay, now it should be really direct with we want you to give feedback to your government. We want you to be holding your government accountable. And yet, we haven't always been particularly accountable and listened to the feedback. And we're telling governments to do that. And so I think there's an issue around modeling and sort of practicing what we preach that we don't have enough discussion about.
Can I just mention one thing? Jen said something that you just said something that connected to what she said. She said, sometimes you have to teach people in your own country, right? And I'm just thinking about all the meetings that we've been to. We tell people about diversity and inclusion, and gender, and I'm like, wait a minute, what country do I live in again? I'm in America. We don't have a whole lot of diversity in so many in our Congress. We don't have a whole lot of diversity in many things. Many organizations have no real people of color in leadership. So when I go to meetings in Haiti and I'm trying to convince them to do something that they know that we don't even do, you seem weird, So I think when you said that about educating our own people, that's also our responsibility, because sometimes we lack credibility when we go into some of these communities talking about things that people know we don't really have. So I really want to mention that because that's totally connected. Thank you.
And I just on the example of the drawings that you brought up, one of the positive things, or I thought it was a good example that I had seen a number of years ago in Myanmar was actually when it was actually projects where they had a lot of done years of work at the village level of doing very participatory drawings and all lots of, and I went to lots of villages, and they would pull out their book and they would show all their drawings and all the things, the plans and things that they had come up with, and they used that. They then owned that, and they had that, and they could use that then when they engaged with any organization that showed up wanting to help, or with the government. And I think that part of the problem is sometimes the products of the listening that we do well still remains too often with our organizations and in our languages, and so we're not that the ownership of and that sort of, because that listening is in the consultation, the processes we use are not necessarily locally led. We're also the products of them are not locally led and locally owned. And I think the peer exchanges and sort of the positive deviance approaches of finding people who are doing really good work or who are succeeding in the face of adversity and other people, and learning from what is already working, and that's where the exchanges are absolutely critical. And I mean, I don't think we invest enough in that at all. People learning from each other, and again, it comes back to this sort of, I think, the lack of humility that we think we have the answers rather than just facilitating learning amongst people and from each other rather than us.
Great, thanks. Lots of really exciting points that have come up. I know Susan has to run out a little early, so I'll ask her to address all of those, and then if you have also any closing thoughts you want to leave us with before you have to run out.
There's just a lot of very good conversation that I can relate to easily. The story about communities already wanting to say what you want to hear. I remember being in a Cambodian village a long time ago, and I was doing research, and the WFP Land Cruiser would show up. So all the villagers would run out and say, we definitely need, we definitely need food and oil to, that's the biggest priority we have. 1, 2, 3, our kids they leave. I come back the next year, and UNICEF, the Land Cruiser shows up and said, children, we need school uniforms, right? We didn't even have to have a conversation. They saw the logo on the cars, and they already knew what to say. They didn't even have to have a PRA answer or village development plan. They just saw whatever vehicle shows up, whichever Land Cruiser with their logo, and they knew what to ask for. They were that sophisticated already. It just goes to show you, just to taking that and how carefully you have to take these things. I agree a lot with what was said earlier. I just have 2 points we made. When people were talking, I was a little bit surprised because, what I work with is actually local entities. Okay, maybe we need to talk about that a little bit more. That in this day and age, especially with a lot of countries opening up, civil society opening up, for me, it's really not about me parachuting into a country. It's actually about, okay, what partnership am I developing with governments, okay, who have the language, who know the culture better than we do, and local NGOs. Okay, so this whole thing of I feel a little bit like that's not what I deal with. I mean, we put a lot of value in working with local entities. Okay, so this day and age, I think of kind of flying in and basically saying, okay, well, I'm going to go to the village and listen anymore. For me, I support local governments to do that and local NGOs to do that because they're best suited to do that. So I think that's an important kind of twist on this that's interesting. This point on responding to grievance, so we have this very real problem that even if you get put feedback mechanisms into place, the help desk, for example, right? You call it, was it 311 in DC? The problem is in a lot of these governments, they actually don't have anybody pick up the phone, right? So I had a place in Laos, so ethnic minorities were calling the phone, they'd never heard an answering machine before, so they were talking in a language, the people in the capital didn't know that local language. We had 5 translators trying to figure out what the person was saying, and it's all that. So I think this whole idea of how do you respond to these and whether or not is it worth even raising expectations and putting those feedback mechanisms in place? Does it do more harm than good? Okay, I've had governments tell me, so even though it's a requirement of World Bank financing, you have to have grievance redress mechanisms. I've had governments tell me, said, Susan, what are you doing? We don't want to hear from anybody. Are you kidding? I don't want to open that grievance box. So it's a hard nut to crack, right? I mean, just like in the U.S., I didn't get my garbage collected for years in D.C. But that being said, in other places that, so trying to get that going, I think it's a very complex issue. I had a discussion on gender-based violence yesterday. We had a whole discussion for 3 hours on whether or not if you have a grievance redress mechanism and you don't have a responder, is it worse having that response? If you have no response, no service provided to help people, is it worse? Right. So there's a lot of that kind of thinking that needs to take place. And even if, with all our best intentions, if you get that input, is it necessarily a good thing? Does it create more harm than good in some of these countries? That's something I think we need to think through that complexity.
Thank you so much for joining us. We still have a few more minutes with our other panels, but thank you for your time here. I think that's a really important point. Speaking on behalf of Feedback Labs, I will say when you have bad feedback mechanisms, yes, they are in fact worse than no feedback mechanisms. And I think part of the reason for that is because essentially you're eroding trust. And so I'd love to hear from the two of you a little bit about your thoughts on this idea of trust. Part of the explanation of this panel session was it takes time to build trust and respect with our local partners and participants. And trust is such a key part of being able to get the real feedback. We talked about people giving you what you want to hear, and one way to get around that is by this trust building. So how have you seen trust building work? What do you see as the role of trust within feedback collection and listening?
Interestingly enough, I think the issue of trust is connected to the messenger, right? Who's the messenger? An example of that, during this whole sexual violence, sexual assault situation that happened in Oxfam in Haiti, that happened in 2011, that was resurfaced again in the context of Me Too last year. One of the things that Oxfam decided to do was to create this hotline for people to call in and to be able to report issues of sexual assault, violence, and all that. And I remember thinking at the time that that's probably not going to work because the trust doesn't exist in the communities where people would think to themselves, if I call this hotline, who's listening? Who's the person on the other end? Is it someone who might, when I tell my name or my story, is it someone that will recognize me? Is it someone that will tell people where I come from about me? And because we didn't have any of that anyway, that idea of using a hotline to sort of tell about sexual violence seemed like it was not going to work. And I think that we could, and I think that had we gone through a process of really understanding the culture of Haiti, which is quite superstitious, and people sometimes wouldn't trust to leave some random voicemail on a hotline talking about sexual assault. There's no way that's going to happen, right? And so I was thinking, when we were coming up, I was not at Oxfam at the time, but when they were coming up with this, I was thinking, who's advising you again, right? Who's telling you that this is one option? Maybe we have to do a better job of the people that we are listening to, and we have to do a better job of how that translates into people working at the organization and who those people are. Because if there was any Haitian person that was working in that role would have said, I don't think that that's a good idea. I think that those people are not going to call your hotline. So I think that we lack that ability to kind of understand the context, translate that context, that contextual understanding into how we discuss what kind of programming we want, and how we listen to the feedback, and how we take that feedback and make it into something. I think there's a disconnect along each of those steps.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think it also comes back to the point we heard over here earlier about closing the loop and responding. So it's one thing to call into a hotline if you're questioning who is going to be there, but if you also don't think that there will be any response, what is
Right, that's the whole right.
Exactly. Dana?
Yeah, I think the it's personal and it's organizational, and I think that so what you're talking about is also, you know, whether people trust the mechanism and the method that's being used, but it's also the person who's actually going to be receiving that, and so, you know, I mean, I think it's human nature, right? If you're going to share something, you're kind of, you know, you often are thinking, who's going to hear that? How is this going to be used? Even when I get, you know, the phone calls for surveys or whatever, I'm like, do I want to answer? You know, who's this going to? Why are you asking me all these personal questions? And we don't sit and think about what does it look like from the other side. And I think that, you know, too often we don't, when we do assessments, I don't think we look at the ways that people, what are the channels that people already have for giving feedback, and what works, and sort of how is that done, and what are ways that we can try to utilize those mechanisms. Hotline, you know, they're very common here. That's not a common thing in a lot of Haiti. I remember seeing this great sign when we did at CDA, we did a case study on the feedback mechanisms being used in Haiti. And there was like this one pole that had, I kid you not, 30 signs with hotline numbers to call. You know, everybody and their brother used hotlines, and most of them weren't particularly effective. And the reason they weren't effective, well, I mean, one was just calling, but even when people did call, the systems weren't always there to process and make sure that those whether it was complaints or feedback got dealt with, and that and so people they have to trust that there's going to be some kind of response. And I think we have to be clear sometimes, are we here just to really listen and sort of let people vent, or are we actually here to take some action? And most of the time people are expecting some kind of a response, even if it's something you or your organization can't deal with, that you will take responsibility for sharing it with someone who can. And I think that's where some of these break down, and I know there's been attempts in Nepal and some other places to try common platforms. But I think that, you know, that we don't have the systems necessarily in place, and the commitment at a very senior levels, often within organizations, to put the resources that are necessary behind having a robust way, you know, to actually respond. And I think just to build the trust is, you know, so it's both the organization and whether people believe that organization, whether it be local or international, how it's responded in the past and how it's behaved in the past is going to shape how people are going to engage with it in the future and currently. And so we come in, and this also is what happens when we're working. We select local partners sometimes really quickly without doing the due diligence to know whether that partner is actually a briefcase NGO that got created yesterday because there's funding on the table, or whether it's a really community-based organization that has deep roots and is trusted by the community. And that's another piece where that the front, you know, the front line staff and the people most of the time that are really at the community level are local, and they're working often for local organizations. And we need to understand how well are they trusted. And when we assume that they can, be our representatives in a way, sort of down that chain, I mean, we've got, donors funding internationals, funding locals, which hopefully we can break that chain up at some point. That has to, if we're ever going to be locally led, that's got to be tossed. But no matter what, whoever's at that point of contact, we need to make sure that the people, as well as the mechanisms and methods for listening and gathering and responding to feedback are trusted.
Well, I could stay here gabbing and asking you questions all day, but I know that there are probably a lot of other good questions from the audience, so would like to open it up again for anyone who has questions. So many.
Doesn't always happen. So here was my question, and I think you actually went into that direction. A lot of the feedback mechanisms have that kind of distance, capital city to community, not a real subsidiarity kind of thing where the community is going to handle it unless they fail, and then there's a place to turn to. And so, do we have any kind of systematic review of those community mechanisms of trusted communities? What are best practices in supporting communities and having those sustainable, community-owned civil society groups that through which people are achieving their own aspirations, not responding to aid?
Okay, let's take maybe two more.
Can you all hear me? I'm just curious how the conversation, and maybe this is not so much a question for the panel as it is for everyone in this room, like how the conversation changes when money is not part of the equation. When there isn't a car with the UNICEF logo coming in, there are other local communities coming in and having discussions. I'm curious if anyone's work involves money not being part of the equation.
Ours does.
I don't really have sort of a response to that is that I work at Global Giving, and so we're a crowdfunding platform for a lot of nonprofits. So it's not that money's not involved, but we're not necessarily the grantee. We're just the middle person in the equation. And so I've been, in visiting partners, it's really nice to not have that power dynamic. And they'll honestly talk to you about the times that they've failed, because you're not really the decision maker in their funding in a lot of those instances, and it does feel like a much more honest interaction. And I don't know how you get rid of that if you are, if you're the gatekeeper to millions of dollars.
My question is very brief. What do you do when you don't hear what you want to hear? And we touched on this a little bit, and about some of the challenges inherent in that. Like hearing tough feedback makes one afraid for their jobs, or like even if we're saying we want to work ourselves out of job, that's not real. But what do you do when you hear things like, what we want is for you all to leave, quit your jobs, leave our country, or what we want is, yes, for you to give us all your money, colonial reparations, give us your money. How do you deal with that?
I wanted to comment on, the responding in hotlines. One phrase that gets put in a lot of proposals is the use of referral pathway. So it could be for gender-based violence, it could be complaints or different things. And I find that those often rely on formal organizations. They could be local, but it takes out of the equation the informal. And many times your referral pathway for very delicate things is being able to contact a midwife or a family member. And that if we think about how do we activate and tap better into those informal networks, and that's part of the also community-led development. And I'd say build the skill sets, capacity there to support versus more formal institutions, because for a lot of these topics, the trust issue with local institutions can be problematic.
Great, so we only have about 5 minutes left, although I wish we had much longer, so I'll give you each an opportunity to make some closing thoughts. I'm sure they'll be around for a few minutes afterwards, so if you have questions, I'm offering up their
There's a
time.
party later, lots of time during the party.
Exactly, lots of time, so I don't know, I'll let you guys, who wants to go first?
I'll try. No, really good questions. I think, I mean, on how to deal with, on sort of the trust and some of the best practices. I mean, I guess the better ones that I've seen is when you're present, you know, when you're there, and you just have to spend the time. And if you aren't, you need to find a way that the partners, the people that you're working with, are. And you know, I know John, you mentioned that you guys have examples of that with listeners and with other mechanisms. And I think some of the best examples I've seen are where we've gone back to places where those communities have really gone through that longer term process, and where they have owned and the planning and seeing themselves do things, you know, doing things by themselves with very little outside money and outside support, that lasts. And so, you know, really looking at, even as we do community development work, are we looking at how we are helping local leaders and community groups listen and respond to feedback from their own communities? It is not, so if we're really, you know, this is about being community-led, that has to be part of that process, and not just, this is something we're doing, but like setting, like I said, setting that expectation, like top to bottom, in all those relationships and along the way, the organizations, that there is going to be some that you are open to and going to be willing to, you know, listen to feedback, critical and not. And I think one of the things that's frustrating is that often, you know, feedback can be a really positive thing. We have this notion that it's always negative. It's like, and there is a difference between a feedback mechanism and a complaints mechanism. And we have unfortunately lumped the two together. And, you know, if you think about it, in the business world, it's client satisfaction, right? And it's seen about, this is about how do we make sure that we have the right, our clients are satisfied, that we keep them coming back. We don't take, you know, the clients in the aid business are the donors, are not, I don't use the term beneficiaries here. I don't know what you guys came up with this morning. I wasn't here. I was hoping to hear. You did.
We have a lot of words.
20 or 30.
20 or 30.
All right. Well, those are the people that, you know, we're talking about at the community level, those are the clients. And so how do we think about that mindset, and how is that part of the approach that we're taking in supporting community-led development? Because if we exhibit and sort of manifest that, you know, we're not open to criticism, that's going to get passed down. Like you know, people, it's modeling good behavior. I mean, if you're a parent, you know, we try to do these things with our kids. Some of us try, not always doing it successfully. I think, you know, the other piece that, and I'm sure Susan would say this, is, you know, at the end of the day, this does need to be something that governments do. And how are we building that within governance structures, and helping people to have their voices heard, and using the channels that do exist, and not always having parallel. That was part of Haiti also had all these parallel channels that, you know, were like undercutting each other sometimes. And I think when you don't, you know, I'll give a personal example. When I lived in Indonesia, we had I was with Mercy Corps, and we were funding, everything we did was through local organizations, so it was kind of doing it and building capacity at the same time. And so we were going, we instituted an open meeting, very rapat terbuka, as we call it. You know, this is an open meeting where the management, local and national, were there, and partners could come and ask any question, lodge any complaint, give any feedback. And if we couldn't answer it in that meeting, for some reason, if it were required, we had to get information elsewhere, we would commit to the next meeting to responding to that. That worked because they saw that we were serious about addressing their concerns. And we were making changes all the time. It's the iterating, it's the adapting. If you're not gonna, don't bother asking if you're not gonna use the information. If you really aren't curious, if you're really not willing to grow, to change, to adapt, don't bother. And be honest about that. But when you open up, you know, and say, I really want to hear, you've got to be open to hearing things you might not want to hear, and that may fundamentally challenge your entire theory of change, your approach, and think about, so then what are we going to do with that? But too often we say, okay, yes, and then we still go on and do what we think we want to do. And so I think that at the end of the day, we've got to have that curiosity and that humility and patience and take time to listen.
Thank you.
So your question is the best. What do we do when say, for example, they want to tell us to get out of their country? So I used to always tell my friends when I worked in Haiti that if I were the Prime Minister of Haiti or the President, my first order of business would be to expel every NGO. And I used to say that just to say, and have everyone register to come back into my country. The idea that we operated in this country without restraint, without boundaries, without anything, just in the country, doing whatever we were doing all over the country, no rhyme or reason, no commitment to just everywhere. That would have been my response to that question. I feel that at the end of the day, we have operated in that part of the world, certainly in Haiti, in a very colonial, imperialistic way for many years. And so we have now this situation where Greg says, maybe it's a country that we won't be able to help. And that saddens me greatly, because Haiti is an important country in the Caribbean, certainly a country that came out of slavery. And so to know that 150 years later, we're in a place where we could actually think to ourselves that it's not a country that we can fix. Because and so for me, it means that at the end of all these conversations about listening and words and beneficiaries and all these things put together, I feel that at the end, the core of development, going back to what we talked about this morning, why are we there? What is development for? When you use the word development, it implies that something needs developing, that something needs fixing, something needs bettering, something needs all these, and what is at the core of that? And if we are here today, we're having this conversation, we'll have it in the next 30 years as well. I feel a sense, I think someone said they were hopeful. Did you say you were hopeful? Was it you? Susan said she was hopeful. I am literally the opposite of that, right? As a person watching the process unfold in Haiti after the earthquake, and to see Haiti today, where we have the protests in the street, the gas shortage, the issues with, since the death of Chavez in Venezuela, the petrol Caribbean, all those things has just, just exacerbated already bad situations. So I'm not as hopeful that we really understand. And I'd like to mention one thing. If I had to do anything in these countries after I expelled everyone and they came back, I would require any NGO coming to work in my country to send people who are educated in context of the country. I met young women in Haiti in 2010 who did not know that the United States occupied Haiti at one time. And to me, if you are working for my organization and I'm sending you into a post-earthquake environment, and I would not. I don't understand that. That's it.
Thank you. I know we're a little bit over time, so I'm going to wrap up really quickly. I think just with the same comment I had at the beginning of this session, which is we're here in this room because we believe that people should have a say over the decisions that affect their lives. And a lot of the things we've talked about today, even this amazing, well-meaning, wonderful group, have been technical solutions. So we've talked about the words that we use, we've talked about RFP processes, we've talked about survey methods, but really what I believe is what is going to take to make this change is culture change. And that's hard. And we can think about the technical solutions, that's a little bit easier. We can change the words we use, it's a little bit easier. But it really will require a change, a shift in power that we've been talking about and a change in how we think about and interact with the people that we're working with. So we'll stop there, but thank you all. This, like I said, was a great conversation. I wish we had like 5 more hours. But I guess 5 more hours, yeah.
Thank you so much. That was, we will have a few more hours in the reception in just a minute. But I'm now going to introduce one of my favorite human beings who, one of our first conversations, she was working with program officers in her organization about advocacy, and their response was, why would I want to do that? And but she succeeded in facilitating them in doing that and discovering their inner advocates. So Filmona and I have known each other a fair fraction of her tender years, but I'm going to introduce her, and she is going to do the next session on really pulling this into action and looking at what's next, and then we'll break. And then we'll have a little bit of an event evaluation on our little phones, and then we'll be done for the day. So, Filmona.
So I realize it's just me, the last barrier between you and wine. So I'll make it fast. But really, this last part of this session is the call to action, and it's because, you know, principles are great. I've been in DC, you've read lots of report with lots of beautiful language that doesn't actually translate into anything much. And so for this last 15-20 minutes, we really want to think about how do we put all these words into action, meaningful action that's actually going to have some kind of impact. I think it was someone with investment earlier who said words are great, but action is better. So want to think about, like, concretely what are maybe the 5 or 6 things that we as individuals, so not our organizations, because trying to change an organization is going to be here another 30 years, but what can we as individuals do to actually make an impact and improve this situation for ourselves? And so one thing I wanted to start off with before we think about those action points is really, you know, what are some of those things that we want to change? So I've been in DC doing advocacy, international development work for about 14 years, and I would say not a month goes by that I'm just not shocked and appalled by, you know, the lack of representation when it comes either in policy conversations, et cetera. And so I wanted to think about first kind of like the 5 I consider some of the most egregious examples of what happens on a regular basis. And then again, think about concretely what can we as individuals in these organizations do. So number 1, again, I'm always amazed at the lack of representation at the table, the lack of diversity, especially the lack of local voices at the table. I can't tell you how many times I'm the only person of color sitting at a policy conversation surrounded by people who themselves have never lived in a developing country, never been poor, never been refugees, never not had running water. And I'm always thinking, like, how are you all going to be the ones to come up with the correct answer? So the lack of representation at the decision-making table is sad. So I think the next thing is kind of the token representation. You know, how many times have we been at the table, there are maybe local voices represented, but who don't actually have a chance to really weigh in when it comes to making the decisions, you know? So it's great to have someone there to say, we have a local voice, but do they really, and I think this gets back to what someone said earlier about, are they just telling you what you want to hear so that way they can maintain this status? Or are you actually asking for genuine participation here? I think the third thing is kind of this information sharing after a decision is made. Even recently, you know, myself having participated in this international coalition working on a particular new global advocacy campaign, and again, it was just amazing that it was, you know, American, European folks at the table. I was the only person of color yet again. And we're working on this particular campaign, yet none of the people at the table actually represented any of the regions where this campaign was going to be implemented. And, you know, so at the end, it was me going to the organizers saying, I think this was a great conversation, but there are a few people who really should have been represented who weren't even here. How could we possibly come up with a meaningful strategy without these voices at the table? Telling them after the fact, after we've already sat around for 3 days and came up with a campaign strategy, I mean, that's just sharing information and not actually allowing for meaningful input. I think another issue someone else brought up before is kind of this idea of consulting with folks, but again, after a program has already been determined. And then another idea someone had earlier, someone said, is kind of arriving with kind of these pre-packaged agendas. So again, having already determined with the donor, whomever else, what's going to happen, and already having that decided before there's any even conversations with the community. So thinking then, these are some of the concerns that we see on a very regular basis, then what are the concrete things that we as individuals can do? And so I'm going to ask for input, but I'm going to give you a few since I have the mic right now. And so the first one I would say is, I think it'd be helpful for everyone in this room to be a vocal advocate for local voices. Again, in that conversation I talked about strategy meeting I was in a few months ago. I couldn't believe that I seemed to be the only one to notice that there was a lack of local representation. And I thought it was disappointing that it was up to me to have to be the one to point that out and to ask for something different next time to ensure that in the follow-up conversations there were other voices, regional voices who were going to be represented. So one thing that I would say is, be a local advocate or be a vocal advocate so that it's not left up to the only people of color in the room to have to point this out. I think the more voices who can point this out and are willing to ask for the change, the better. I think another one, someone mentioned earlier about the dog and pony shows and how it's impossible to get quality information there. So I think one thing that we could all do is kind of value that informal input. Someone else talked about being in I think it was a Haiti example, being in a room, hearing everyone say what needed to be said, but seeing the locals in the back of the room rolling their eyes. I can't tell you how many times that happened. But valuing that kind of informal input, making sure that when you're in these conversations, are you looking at the back of the room to see who's rolling their eyes, who's not happy? Are you going to start a conversation with them? Are you then bringing that conversation back to your community, to your organization to say, I think this was at the consensus at the table, but having spoken to some other folks, this is what they actually want. This is what would be more valuable. So I think being able to, access that informal input and making sure that it's seen as valuable and kind of integrate into our thinking would go a long way. One other great thing that someone said is ensuring that the end products are more kind of community user friendly. I love that because it's true. How many lengthy reports do we have with countless citations that are nice and academic? But at the end of the day, we're writing those reports for ourselves. So what is it concretely then you can do? I can say within my own organization, I failed to mention this at the beginning, but I run a coalition called Publish What You Pay US. So we're a coalition of NGOs that do advocacy on transparency in oil, gas, and mining revenues so that communities can actually have a sense of how much money their government is receiving for their natural resources. And so we're an organization that has very detailed, wonky payment data from extractive companies. And one thing I said for ourselves is, we're not publishing another report without a simple 2-pager to go along with it. There is no way that anyone in these actual communities is going to read these 30, 40, 50, 100-page reports. Why are we putting them out for ourselves? What is the point in this? And so that's one concrete thing I have done myself with my own organization, saying that, okay, we can do those reports that everybody loves, but we're also going to do one that's community friendly as well if we're going to go forward on this path. So I would love to hear your ideas on concretely what within the next every week, that you're able to do within your own organization to kind of implement and be the change that we have talked about today.
I've got 2 other people from my organization here, so let's see if we can get on the same page. Okay. On the first the first action is actually on that word beneficiary. I don't think that I need conversion when I talk to people one-on-one, but we still have a lot of documents in the organization. There's still communication materials. We just launched a new campaign at World Vision, where still there is a commitment about the people that we work or we serve, but the word beneficiary, it's used. So bringing the same conversation back at home and having a kind of a similar session, I'd love to do that, and I think we have 2 other people, as I said, here, so hopefully there's going to be a little bit of accountability on what I say, as well as I can comment that. That's one action. The second, it's very similar to what you said last, which is about community-friendly materials for sending back. We have already started where the first thing that we ask ourselves to produce when we get, I work on research, learning, and analytics. So products that we get are research studies. Translating them, and we haven't managed 2-pagers, but I've brought a few down to 6. Yes, and they were just sent back. One of them is a ex-post evaluation in Uganda, and that's the first one that we have done. But try to do a lot more of those. And try to create the space for that, because as easy as it may sound, putting something that is 120 pages in 6 pages took longer than I thought it would. So, yeah. Those were my 2 actions.
Thank you.
Communication and the word beneficiary.
Comment up here.
Hopefully there's not too much feedback. I have a model of something we do to propose, but then I also have a question for you. I think we do something interesting at Islamic Relief. We're kind of a federated. We work in 40 permanent countries and upwards of that when there's disasters and emergencies. But we allow the local communities and the local country offices to do the needs assessment and the designs, and they upload them into a centralized database. And then it goes to the funding partners, as the US and Canada and Australia and our European partners, to actually look at those and make those decisions based on our own priorities and strategies and countries that we can work in or can't work in, depending on the political context. So I think it's an interesting model. I have a question. We've committed to being around all those tables and all these conversations and the policy meetings, as distasteful as some of them are, but we often are the only Muslim voice at these venues and convenings. And so when does it turn into they're actually listening to our voice, and it's not just tokenism that we get invited just so they can check off a tick box that they invited a Muslim organization?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that one. I think part of it is, I think it starts off as tokenism a lot of times, but then I think maybe it's up to us to ensure that when we're at the table, that we're making the best use of that platform. Oftentimes in these meetings, everyone comes up with brilliant ideas, but when it comes time to fill out the tasks and responsibilities, no one wants to do them. So then making sure that you are volunteering for those opportunities when it comes to writing up the briefs, whatever it is. And so that way you are not only sitting at the table, but getting in the spotlight. I found that is helpful. So taking on those leadership roles, showing up, being present, and just making sure that you're not on the sidelines, but you're actually present. I find that's one way to ensure that you're going to get noticed.
So similar to Holta, I'm in the monitoring and evaluation space within Relief. And so John, you'll be pleased to know, so we sent out an email this week from Nancy to all country and regional leadership that we are removing the word beneficiary entirely from non-donor formatted template documentation. So all of our external facing communications, our website's been scrubbed already. Any technical research that is done proactively or anything that is sent to the donor that is not formally requested by the donor, we won't be using the word. We'll still be having conversations about what to use. And I still think back about when we had this first conversation in Interaction, and one of the best responses to the question, what else do we use, was people were throwing out their words, and none of them are wrong, but then one person said, well, you know, it can take so long to explain, and someone else said, yeah, but that's incumbent on us. If it takes more than one word to describe the people that we're working with, then we should be doing so. And so I think internally we'll keep on finding those different words and ways of defining our relationships with our communities. So that's one priority. And the second, also, to Holtz's point, is finding a way to give the data back to the people that we take it from. In evaluation, I cringe when we see some of the questions that we ask people. And I love it. I try and, you know, we're asking about some very personal things. I always ask people, if you wouldn't answer this to somebody who randomly knocks on your door, maybe we shouldn't be asking about their, you know, their school schedule. And so for me, a priority is respecting their dignity as far as what I choose to extract, but also making sure that I close that loop. So if I take data from a village or a community, we need to give that data back to them so that they can do something with it that we may not know what to do with. So those are my two priorities for RI over the next year.
Two things that we could do. One was mentioned by one of the panelists, and that's to individually participate in an implicit bias training to address our own implicit biases. And the other was also brought up by a few different panelists, which I really like, which is to advocate and organize within our own organizations to strengthen and build cultures of learning and growth and listening, and making sure that we're taking the time and the money and the space internally to practice those things to make us better at this work, but also if we're asking others of these things, we should be able to do it ourselves.
Actually, while I have the mic, this is just an idea I had, and it's something I'll technically be running by you, John, so sorry to throw you under the bus if you know. But I feel like practically today we've talked a lot about like mindset changes, and the reality is that as far as community-led development goes, we haven't really achieved it yet. And that as far as like dignifying humans in development, we've missed it in a lot of places. And it's because we haven't been asking the right questions. And so even taking like the bullet points that we had today for our 3 sessions and maybe running through for the people who are in attendance here and even distributing it throughout the movement, maybe taking like each of those bullet points and finding like questions where we can start looking for those gaps in the ways that we've been doing development. So for instance, with our final segment that we had here, as Angela was sharing some stories about like a lot of the Oxfam initiatives in Haiti, how they put in the hotline, but the reality is that that's not what the people needed and that's not what they responded to. And so if there were frontline questions of how does this affect the local people? How would they genuinely respond to this? And things like that on the front line that the designers would have seen. And so just like questions to be thinking about in the design and the implementation of these projects. Would that be a practical thing that could actually be done?
Take it on. The answer is yes, and we can talk more. I think it's not just gaps. Mm-hmm. We're up against thousands of years of patriarchy. Mm-hmm. We have to smash the patriarchy. Yeah. So it's going to take more than questions, but that's a good way to start. Mm-hmm. I'm totally for it.
Mm-hmm. All right, so maybe one final comment over here, and then I'll turn it over
to Matt, and then to Andrea.
Thank you. And one of the actions I'm going to do is doing exactly what we are doing today with people who are close to us. Can be my in-laws, my neighbors, because we do need to engage the public, and people still see international aid as like helping them, like kind of a bit of a power dynamic. But it is very essential to have one-on-one and general discussion and really spend time and value the one-on-one, because one person change and we nurture the ripple effect. So I'm going to engage with any opportunity that arises. Thank you.
Excuse me, could I slip in when I had the mic
yes.
that you didn't
sorry,
see?
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm not working for an organization, I'm working for a university, but I didn't know, I'm really glad to hear about the meta survey or whatever you're calling Hailemichael and the work being done there. It's something that I've been interested in and actually just started working on myself with the help of a research assistant to try to look at some of these things. So I would just like to ask if I'm particularly interested in processes in rural communities where people have sort of started from scratch, in the sense that you don't start with a funding project, but you're starting with a process of accompanying the community to really help them then move towards something that might involve funding. So if you know of anything like that, and I'll talk to you and others who are already working on this, I would love to know about it. And because you asked a question about, has anybody been involved in projects where there was no funding? I have, and where we started and we were very clear, we don't have money, but if you get to a certain point of planning, then we will help you find funding, but we're not a funding organization. So that's the kind of stuff I'm interested in hearing more about, if anybody's doing that and what kind of models there are.
We have a lot of it.
Good. No, I'm sure. And I can give you my card and all that. Thanks for letting me slip that in.
Okay. Thank you all for your ideas.
Thank you, Filmona. Okay.
And to Andrea for closing remarks.
Awesome. Hi. Hi, I'm Andrea Findley from Ascension Global Mission. We have the distinct, really a very special pleasure of being a co-sponsor of this event in a very small way, but really we want to give thanks to the many organizations and people who have been fundamental in helping this event happen. Number one, I think, although she's the one who gave me the list, she did not mention her name, is Gunjan Veda, who's not with us in person, but I think she's on the camera. From the Hunger Project and the Movement for Community-Led Development, along with Matt Cruz of Relief International. Both of these individuals, I understand, have been working behind the scenes tirelessly with a group of volunteers to orchestrate this event, and it's very much appreciated. Along with Bread for the World, this beautiful venue. I mean, I didn't even know a building like this existed where we have such great views of DC and sunshine. I'm from Portland, Oregon, so like, this is a real delight to see the sunshine. Also, of course, our keynote speakers, Bonnie Glick, Nancy Wilcon from Relief International, all the panelists and moderators, obviously. Without the great discussion of everyone in this room, this symposium wouldn't have been possible. Global Giving and the Global Partnership for Social Accountability for spreading the word about this event. And John, have I missed anyone? And John, for starting the movement to begin with, co-founding it. Is there anyone else?
Mary Kate and all the volunteers. If you're one of the volunteers or interns,
so thank you very much. And there's now a brief or a long reception, depending on the after party.
Yeah, no. Here's the thing: have as much party as you want until 5:30, and then you really have to leave. So we have until 5:30 for this reception, and so please enjoy.